She didn't run because she was afraid of him. She ran because he chose her sister. She ran with his heirs in her womb, 2 heartbeats he would never know existed, tucked away beneath a gown of deep green velvet that Cassia had long since discarded. By the time the celebration reached its peak, by the time torches blazed in every window of the palace, and the crowd chanted the name of his new queen, she was already 3 miles into the dark. She told herself she wasn't looking back. She lied. This is the story of what happens when the wrong woman disappears, and what is set in motion the moment someone finally goes to find her. The Palace of Vora was not a welcoming place. It rose from the cliffs above the city like a crown of black stone, its towers cutting into clouds that never seemed to fully part. From the outside, it looked like power. And from the inside, from Seren's particular vantage point, which was to say the margins of every room, the backs of every corridor, it looked like a trap. She had been born there. That was the first thing people whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. The second thing they whispered was about her mother, a servant, a secret, a woman Lord Harwin had refused to acknowledge until she died, bringing his daughter into the world, and even then, his acknowledgement amounted to nothing more than a roof, a bed, and a warning. Don't cause trouble. Seren had spent 19 years perfecting the art of exactly that, not causing trouble, being invisible, moving through the palace like a shadow that no one had thought to question. There had been whispers, once quickly silenced, about a strange light filling the birthing chamber that night. About her mother being something more than what she seemed. Lord Harwin had shut those whispers down with the particular thoroughness of a man who understood what it meant to let rumor take root. All that remained was Seren, tolerated, never wanted. Her half-sister Cassia occupied the opposite end of every spectrum, golden-haired to Seren's dark, celebrated to Seren's ignored, raised as Lord Harwin's legitimate heir, groomed for an advantageous marriage, dressed in silks while Seren wore last season's cast-offs. Cassia had a cruelty that was both instinctive and patient, the kind that waited for the right moment to be truly effective. It was one of Cassia's games that first brought Seren to the king's library, a hunt. Through the palace corridors, Cassia's friends on one end, Seren on the other, with the rules unspoken and familiar. She was the prey. She had learned early that hiding in her own chambers only made it worse. They would simply wait. So she ran, weaving deeper into parts of the palace she rarely visited until she found a door slightly ajar and slipped through it. The library was dark except for a single dying fire. She pressed herself into an alcove behind a tapestry and tried to slow her breathing. "You can come out." The voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that understood it would be obeyed. "I can smell your fear from across the room." She knew that voice. Everyone in Vora knew that voice. Alpha King Theron had ruled these lands for 12 years. He was said to be cold, calculating, and a man who had ended a border war with 3 strategic decisions and a silence so pointed it had made 3 generals resign in shame. She should have pressed herself further into the alcove, should have found a reason, any reason, to stay invisible. Instead, she stepped out. He sat in a leather chair near the hearth, a book open in his lap, and even in the dimness she could see the sharp angles of his jaw, the pale gleam of his eyes, watching her with an assessment that was neither warm nor hostile, just precise. "You're Lord Harwin's bastard," he said, not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty. Why are you hiding in my library?" She should have lied. Every trained instinct she possessed said to lie to invent a reason that would get her dismissed without consequence. But something about the darkness, knew about the exhaustion in his voice beneath the precision, made her reckless. "My sister's friends find it entertaining to hunt me through the palace," she said. "I needed somewhere they wouldn't look." A silence stretched between them. Then, impossibly, the king laughed. It was a low, rusty sound, as though it hadn't been used in a long time, and the mechanism had stiffened. He gestured to the chair across from his. "Sit," he said. "They won't find you here." She sat. They talked until dawn painted the windows pale gray. He asked her things no one had ever bothered to ask. What she thought, what she read, what she dreamed about in the quiet hours when no one was watching. She learned that he despised politics while excelling at it, that he found most nobles both insufferable and necessary, and that this library was the only room in the entire palace where he could breathe properly. When she finally rose to leave, he caught her wrist. "Come back tomorrow night." Not a question, not a command exactly, something in between. She came back, and the night after that, and the night after that. Somewhere in the third week, the conversation shifted. She noticed the way his eyes would stop moving when she spoke fully stopped, as though what she was saying was the only thing in the room. She noticed the way he kept the light low, as if brightness might break something fragile between them. She noticed the way his hand lingered a half-second too long when he passed her a book. It was Seren who closed the distance first. She would remember that for the rest of her life, the way she had stood across the few feet of firelit space between their chairs, and pressed her mouth to his before she could reason herself out of it. He went still for one terrible beat. Then his hands were in her hair. "We shouldn't," he said against her throat much later. "I know," she breathed back. They did anyway. 3 months of stolen hours, of darkness and whispered confessions and a connection that left marks on the soul that daylight couldn't reach. He kept the room dim, never more than a single candle placed at a distance. She learned the geography of him in shadows, the scars along his ribs, the way he shuddered when she found the curve of his neck, the particular sound he made when he was trying not to feel something and failing. "I'll choose you," he whispered one night, his palm warm and flat against her stomach. "At the ceremony? You, and only you." Serene's heart soared so high she thought it might never come back down. She should have known that anything that flies that high is always, always destined to fall. The great hall blazed with 1,000 candles the night of the mating ceremony. The women of noble blood had been arranged in a single line along the hall's southern wall, daughters of lords and generals, each one dressed as though the king's eyes might fall on her and find something worth keeping. They whispered to each other behind cupped hands. They adjusted their hair, their posture, their carefully composed expressions. Serene stood among them and pressed a hand to her stomach. 4 days ago, the palace healer had looked at her across a plain wooden table and said very quietly, "Twins." 2 heartbeats, 2 lives already forming in the dark. "In a blessing from the moon goddess herself," the healer had murmured, as though she didn't quite believe what her own hands were telling her. Serene had wept. Then she had sat very still for a long time, calculating. She would tell him after he chose her. After the ceremony, everything was made simple. Then she would tell him, and their happiness would be so complete she wouldn't have words for it. The great doors swung open. Alpha King Theron entered, and the hall fell silent the way halls do when something genuinely powerful walks into them, not from protocol, but from instinct. He wore formal black, silver-gray hair brushed back from a face that could have been carved from the same stone as the palace walls. His eyes swept the assembly with cold assessment, revealing nothing. This was the king the kingdom knew. Cold, precise, and without mercy. But Seren knew the man beneath that mask. She had felt him tremble. She had heard him laugh in the dark. She had held him while he slept and watched the hard lines of his face go soft. He would choose her. She was certain of it. Theron began to walk the line. He moved slowly, stopping before each woman, inhaling the wolf's method of knowing, deeper than sight, deeper than words. Some he dismissed quickly, others received a longer consideration before he moved on. Seren tracked his progress with her pulse hammering against the green velvet of her gown. 10 women away. 5. 3. She could smell him now, pine and wood smoke and something wilder beneath both, the scent she had come to know as well as her own name. His eyes reached her and passed straight through. No recognition, no pause, no flicker. When he walked past her as though she were furniture, as though 3 months of darkness and whispered promises had simply never happened, and stopped in front of Cassia. Cassia, radiant in pale gold that matched her hair, her smile perfectly composed and perfectly practiced, stood in one position to Seren's left. Theron inhaled. Something moved across his face. "I choose Cassia," he announced, "daughter of Lord Harwin, my queen." The hall erupted. Seren felt the floor tilt. She watched Theron raise her sister's hand to his lips, watched Cassia's eyes find hers through the celebrating crowd, find hers specifically, deliberately, with an expression that was not triumph so much as it was confirmation, the satisfied look of someone who has won a game that the other player didn't know they were playing. Cassia knew, and that was the thought that finally broke Seren open. Not the betrayal, not the humiliation, not even the grief of watching the man she loved lead her sister to the dais. The knowledge in Cassia's eyes, the certainty that this had not been a coincidence. She made it to her chambers before the first sob came. She pressed both hands to her stomach and wept until there was nothing left. Then she rose. She wiped her face. She gathered coins, a spare dress, and a cloak. If Cassia knew about the affair, she would eventually learn about the pregnancy. And Cassia had never in her life permitted competition for anything she considered hers. The children could not stay here. Therefore, neither could she. She walked out of the palace while the celebration roared on behind her. No one noticed she was gone. By morning, she had crossed the border into the wildlands. By spring's end, she had disappeared entirely. She traded her mother's pendant for a seat on a merchant's wagon heading south. She told him she was a widow seeking family in a distant province. He didn't ask further. People rarely did when the answers might be inconvenient. The wagon carried her through 3 territories before she stepped off in a village that didn't appear on any map she had ever seen. Thornwick, a cluster of stone cottages pressed into a valley between 2 mountains, a single main road, a blacksmith, a healer, an inn, the kind of place the rest of the world had simply forgotten to notice. Perfect. She called herself Bryn, said her husband had died in a border skirmish, said she had nowhere else to go. The village accepted her the way small, in busy places accept most newcomers without ceremony, without suspicion, simply folding her into the existing rhythm of survival. The blacksmith's wife brought soup when the morning sickness made it impossible to hide. The village healer checked on her each month as the pregnancy progressed, and when the twins arrived on a stormy autumn night, she held them in the candlelight and understood for the first time what it meant to have a reason that outweighed all the loss. A boy and a girl, Ash and Wren. Ash had his father's eyes, pale gray, the color of winter storms, and a watchfulness that arrived too early for his age. Wren had his jaw, his stubbornness, his absolute refusal to accept any boundary as permanent. Looking at them was a knife to the chest. It was also, somehow, the only thing that made the knife bearable. 3 years passed. She took work as a seamstress, saved carefully, eventually purchased a small cottage at the edge of the village, watched her children learn to walk, then run, then climb things they absolutely should not climb, while she stood below with her heart in her throat. She caught news in fragments from traveling merchants. The Alpha King and his new queen had yet to produce an heir. Whispers in the capital about tension in the palace, rumors that the queen was barren or cold or something else entirely that no one dared to say plainly. Seren told herself it didn't matter. That chapter of her life was sealed. But late at night, when the children were finally still, she would sit by the fire and remember the low sound of his laugh, the warmth of his hand against her stomach, and the way he had looked at her in the darkness as though she were the only fixed point in an uncertain world. Had any of it been real? She never found an answer that satisfied her. And then, the stranger arrived. She noticed him first because of the way he stood, not like a man who had been traveling, like a man who had arrived. He was perhaps 30, with a soldier's bearing and a scar cutting across his left cheekbone, dressed in traveling clothes that were slightly too fine for the road he was claiming to be on. He stood at the edge of the village square and let his eyes move slowly, methodically across every cottage, every face, until they found the children. Ash and Wren were playing near the well, stacking stones. Ash's pale eyes caught the morning light as he laughed at something his sister had said. The stranger went very still. Seren abandoned the laundry she was hanging and moved. "Can I help you?" Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "Just passing through." Northern Valdorian accent. She filed that away. "The inn is at the other end of the village." His eyes drifted back to Ash, to those distinctive, unmistakable, pale gray eyes. Lovely children. Their father must be proud. "Their father is dead," Seren said without blinking. A long pause. Then he inclined his head, a gesture that was far too formal for a simple traveler, and walked toward the inn. She didn't relax until he was fully out of sight. Even then, she gathered the children and bolted the cottage door. That night, his window at the inn glowed with candlelight past midnight. He wasn't passing through. He was looking for something. And he left 3 days later. She watched him go from behind her curtain, the children safely tucked away under the pretense of helping with baking at a neighbor's house. Only when his horse disappeared over the northern ridge did she let herself breathe. But relief is a fragile thing. The innkeeper's daughter told her, while dropping off mended linens, that the stranger had been asking questions about newcomers, about young widows, about children with unusual coloring. He knew, or close enough to knowing that the difference didn't matter. That night, Seren began to pack, but when she stood in the doorway of her children's room and watched them sleep, Ash with his fists curled tight even in dreaming, Wren with her dark hair fanned out like she was already running somewhere, something in her chest fractured. When they had friends here, a home. Ash was learning to read. Wren had named every chicken in the blacksmith's yard. How many times could she uproot them before it broke something that couldn't be mended? She decided to wait 1 more week. If nothing happened, she would let herself believe they were safe. 6 days later, he came. She felt him before she heard him. Her hands stilled in the bread dough. Something in the air shifted, thickened, pressing against her skin, the way a storm front does before the rain actually arrives. A presence she had felt 100 times in darkened rooms, but never like this. Never in daylight. Never in the place she had spent 3 years believing was safe. "Mama." Wren looked up from the wooden blocks she was stacking. "What's wrong?" Seren couldn't answer. Her throat had closed entirely. See, 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, each one resonating through the cottage walls like something final. "Ash," her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Take your sister to the back room. Close the door. Don't come out until I call you." Ash looked at her with eyes that understood things a 3-year-old shouldn't understand. He took Wren's hand without argument and disappeared. Seren wiped the flour from her hands. She breathed in. She opened the door. Alpha King Theron stood on her threshold. He was exactly as she remembered, and nothing as she remembered. The same sharp angles, the same silver-gray hair, the same pale eyes that had always seemed to see further than they should. But there were shadows beneath those eyes now, hollows in his cheeks, and the particular gauntness of a man who had been spending himself on something relentless and hadn't slept properly in years. His gaze found her face. Something in him fractured. "Seren," he said. Just her name, nothing more. But the weight in it was 3 years long. "Your Majesty." She watched him flinch at the formality. "You shouldn't be here." "Where else should I be?" It wasn't a question. "I've been looking for you for 3 years. I thought you were dead. I thought someone had taken you. That something had." He stopped, steadied himself. I've sent men to every corner of the kingdom. You never thought to look in the one place you'd never expect a nobleman's daughter to hide. Why did you run?" The words came out raw. "You know why." "I don't. I woke up the morning after the ceremony and you were gone. No word. No reason. Nothing. And I need you to tell me, Seren, because I have spent 3 years constructing explanations and none of them hold." "You married my sister." The words tore from her throat. "You walked directly past me. You looked through me as though I had never existed. And then you announced her name before the entire kingdom." She pressed a hand flat against the doorframe. "What explanation did you require from me?" Something moved through his expression. Not guilt. Something worse. Confusion. "Choose her over you." He said the words slowly, as though testing whether they made sense in his mouth. They clearly didn't. "Seren, I never thought I went to that ceremony intending to choose only you. When I reached the place where you should have been standing," he stopped. "You were there," Seren said. I watched you. The woman I stopped in front of smelled like you, looked like you from a distance." His jaw tightened. "But it wasn't you. I knew it wasn't you. The scent was wrong, close, but not right. And she told me she was Seren. She answered to your name. She said she'd been waiting for me." Seren felt the color drain from her face. The wine. Cassia appeared at her side minutes before the ceremony began, pressing a cup of wine into her hands with a brightness that should have been a warning, the warmth that spread through her chest too quickly, the way her thoughts had gone slow and heavy, the strange distance that settled over everything like fog. She had thought it was nerves. "She drugged me," Seren said very quietly. "She used something to blur my mind, and then she took my place in the line. She must have spent weeks learning to mimic my scent. The full scope of it hit her like a physical blow. She told you she was me. I didn't realize the full extent of it until weeks into the marriage." Theron's voice was hollow. "The woman I had bound myself to was nothing like the person I'd held in that library. Cold where you were warm. Calculating in a way that felt entirely different. By the time I understood what had happened, you were already gone." His hands clenched at his sides. "She told the court you'd run off with a lover, that the shame of being exposed had driven you away. I knew it was a lie. I had no proof, and she was already my queen." 3 years. For 3 years, Seren had spent believing he had looked through her and chosen her sister. 3 years he had spent searching for a woman he never intended to lose. The truth settled over the room with the weight of something irreversible. Then, from the back of the cottage, a door creaked open. Theron's body went completely still. His head turned slowly. His nostrils flared once. "There are children here," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "I can smell them. 2 of them, and their scent is." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Ash stood in the gap of the doorway, one small hand on the handle, his pale gray eyes, his father's eyes, unmistakably, impossibly, his father's eyes fixed on the stranger who had come to their door. Theron made a sound that Seren had no name for. Ren's voice came from somewhere behind her brother. "Mama, is that man our papa? He has Ash's eyes." The room went entirely still. Theron turned to look at Seren, and she had never, in all the time she had known him, in all the ways she had seen him, ever seen that expression on his face. Not at state dinners, not in the darkened library, not even in those rare, unguarded moments when he thought no one was watching. Raw, devastating, terrible hope. "Tell me they're not mine," he rasped. "Tell me, Seren. Tell me they're not, because if they are—" She met his gaze and held it. "I can't," she said quietly, "because they are." Ren, who had never in her 3 years on Earth met a boundary she considered truly applicable to herself, marched directly toward Theron. "Are you really our papa? Mama said our papa died in a war." Theron lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself to her level. This close, the resemblance was impossible to overlook. Ren had Seren's dark hair, her coloring, but the stubborn set of her jaw, the exact angle of her brows, the way she planted her feet when she wanted an answer. All Theron. "I'm not dead," he said. His voice was careful, unsteady at the edges. "I just didn't know where to find you." "Why not? You're supposed to be a king. Kings can find anyone." Something in his expression collapsed. "You're right," he said. "I should have found you sooner. I'm sorry, Ren." Before Seren could intervene, Ren threw her arms around Theron's neck. "That's okay," she announced. "You're here now." She watched the Alpha King of Vora pull her daughter close and shake with silent sobs the controlled, terrible grief of a man who had held himself together past the point where holding together made sense, despite everything. Despite 3 years of pain and running and learning to live without him. Seren felt the first careful stirring of something she wasn't ready to name. Night fell over Thornwick. Theron remained. His 4 guards were dispatched to the inn with firm instructions. The children were bathed, dressed, given stories, kissed, and tucked into their small beds. Serene moved through the routine with the mechanical precision of someone buying time to think. When she came back, he stood by the fire watching the embers. "They're remarkable," he said without turning. "You've raised them well." "I've done my best." "In hiding, in fear." "Yes." He finally turned, and his expression was fierce. "She will pay for this. Every year she stole from you. Every day you spend running. Every moment I lost with my children. I swear to you." "How?" Seren settled into a chair, keeping her voice even. "She's your queen, bound by ceremony. The laws of Dora don't permit setting aside a royal marriage without cause. And cause requires proof. And proof requires witnesses who would never speak against the woman who controls their livelihoods." The fire crackled between them. He had no answer. She had spent 3 years arriving at this conclusion. "There is another problem," she said carefully. "Cassia hasn't produced an heir in 3 years. The whispers have already started. When she learns that 2 heirs already exist, she would never. She drugged me, stole my identity, deceived you before the entire kingdom." Seren's voice went hard. "Do not tell me what Cassia would never do. You don't know her. But I grew up beside her cruelty, and I know exactly what she's capable of when her position is threatened." Silence. Then Theron said very quietly, "We must be careful. Strategic." He moved closer, dropping to one knee before her chair, the Alpha King of Vora on his knees on a cottage floor. "I will establish protection here while I work to expose what she's done. And then—" He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers brushed her cheek. "I need you to know that I'm going to fix this, whatever it takes. You're still married to my sister." "I know." "Then fix that first." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded, accepting the boundary. He rose to leave, and she noticed his hand was trembling, not from emotion, from cold. She caught his arm. His skin was ice beneath her fingers. Not the natural chill of a night wind, something deeper, something that had no business being inside a living body. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for too long. "Theron." When he turned, the mask was entirely gone. What she saw beneath it was an exhaustion so profound it seemed geologically carved into him over the years. And beneath the exhaustion, fear. "There's a curse," he said, "on the kings of Vora, 8 generations old." She said nothing. Let him continue. "It was inflicted on my ancestor by a scorned witch. The terms are simple. When a king of my line binds himself by ceremony to someone who is not his true mate, his life force begins to drain, slowly at first, then faster." He paused. "My ancestors learned to manage it by avoiding deep attachments entirely. A political marriage to someone they felt nothing for kept the curse dormant. No true mate meant no separation to be punished. But you found one? I found you. The words were simple and devastating. And then I was bound to someone else. The curse has been feeding for 3 years. When I found you tonight, I felt you near me again. It recognized what it had been taking from me. It's accelerating. Seren looked at the frost spreading slowly across his knuckles, visible even in the low light. There's a cure, she said, not a question. There is. His voice was barely a sound. The true bond must be completed properly by ceremony and by blood. How only then does the curse release. Which requires dissolving your marriage to Cassia first, which requires proving her crimes, which requires witnesses who would testify against the queen. The trap, complete and elegant. How long? Seren asked. He didn't answer immediately. Weeks, perhaps less. Now that I've found you, the curse knows its grip is threatened. It will fight harder to finish what it started. Then we need to move quickly. She heard her own voice steady out the voice she used with her children when she needed to be the calm in the room, regardless of what was happening in her chest. Cassia can't be argued out of power, but she might be goaded into revealing herself, if there were witnesses present when she did. Something shifted in the air, not warmth, cold, seeping through the cottage walls like winter mist, though it was a mild autumn night. Seren went very still. Theron's face had gone the color of chalk. The door burst open. Cassia stood in the doorway. She was flanked by 4 armed guards and dressed for a long journey, her golden hair catching the firelight. She looked older than Seren remembered. The softness of youth had gone. What remained was harder and far more precise. Well, Cassia breathed, isn't this touching? Theron placed himself between Cassia and Seren, but he swayed visibly, unmistakably, and Seren had to catch his arm to keep him upright. Cassia's eyes narrowed at the gesture. Then her gaze moved past both of them, found the 2 small figures standing now in the bedroom doorway. Everything about her went very, very still. Children, she said. Now 2 of them. A pause. With those eyes. Her voice, when it came again, had climbed into something fraying at the edges. You bore him children, you. She stopped, composed herself, smiled. It was the most frightening thing Seren had ever seen her do. It doesn't matter. They're illegitimate. They have no claim. They have every claim. Theron's voice was weak but absolutely certain. They carry my bloodline. They are my heirs. And you, he straightened despite the cold eating at him, you are a fraud who deceived her way onto my throne. I am your queen, chosen before the entire kingdom. You cannot. You were not chosen. You stole the place of the woman I wanted. You drugged your own sister. You answered to her name. Everything about our marriage was built on a lie. You have no proof. Cassia's smile went sharp. Or the word of a bitter bastard who couldn't accept her place against their anointed queen. Who do you imagine the court will believe? A new voice answered from the doorway behind her. They'll believe me. A woman stood there, wrapped in a traveling cloak. Elderly, her face deeply weathered, her eyes sharp and clear, and utterly unafraid of the queen standing between her and the room. Seren recognized her instantly. Marin, the midwife who had been present at her birth, who had attended her mother's death. I was there 22 years ago, Marin said, stepping forward with the calm authority of someone who has decided they have nothing left to fear. And I was there 3 years ago, when Lady Cassia came to me seeking a particular kind of potion, one to mimic another person's scent. She reached into her cloak, withdrew a small glass vial. I kept a sample. The ingredients are distinctive. I kept records of who purchased them. Cassia lunged, not toward Marin. Her guards hesitated one beat of confusion about whose orders carried greater weight, and in that beat, Cassia's hand found a knife from somewhere in her sleeve, and her eyes went to the children. "If I can't have heirs," she said very quietly, "neither can you." She lunged. Seren moved. She felt the knife across her arm, a white-hot line of pain, and blood spilled warm down her wrist, and felt something else. Something ancient, something that had been coiled inside her for 22 years, waiting for exactly this. Light exploded from her palms, silver, brilliant, absolute. It filled the cottage with a radiance so total that everyone recoiled. And the guard stumbling back, Cassia screaming as the knife fell from her hands, Theron catching himself against the wall. Seren stood at the center of it, power moving through her veins like liquid moonlight, wild, ancient, entirely overwhelming. "Moon-blessed," Marin's voice quiet and certain from the doorway, "just like your mother." The light faded. Serene stood trembling, her wounded arm forgotten, staring at hands that still faintly glowed. Her mother hadn't been an ordinary servant. "You can save him," Marin said quietly. "Your light can break the curse." Seren looked at Theron, collapsed against the wall now, frost spreading rapidly across his chest, his breathing shallow, his eyes barely open. She looked at her children, wide-eyed and clutching each other in the doorway. She looked at Cassia, crumpled on the floor, and she made her choice. "Tell me what to do," she said to Marin, quickly. "The moon-blessed can forge bonds that transcend ordinary ceremony," Marin said, kneeling beside her. "Your mother could have done this, had she lived. You must reach into him, find the corruption where the false bond sits, and burn it away, then replace it with truth." "How?" "You'll know. The power answers to love, child. It always has." Seren placed both hands on Theron's chest. She closed her eyes and reached. The curse fought her immediately. It was old, far older than either of them, and it had spent 3 years feeding, and it had no intention of releasing its hold without a fight. It showed her things. Theron dying in her arms. Her children grew up asking about a father who never came home. And her own hands were empty of the light that had briefly filled them. It whispered that she was untrained, insufficient, too late by half. But beneath the curse, she found him. The man who had laughed in a darkened library like laughter was something he'd forgotten he was allowed. The man who had asked her questions no one had ever thought to ask. The man who had spent 3 years searching for her across every corner of the kingdom because losing her had broken something he didn't know how to name. She wrapped her light around that and pulled. The curse screamed. It clawed at her. The cut on her arm burned. Blood ran from her nose, her ears. Somewhere behind her, she could hear Ren crying and Ash calling her name. She didn't stop. She found the false bond, the twisted thread that linked Theron to Cassia, built on lies and stolen identity, and she burned it. Then she poured everything she had into replacing it with truth, her truth, 3 years of it. Every night she had sat by that fire and missed him. Every morning she had looked at her children and seen his eyes looking back. Every story she had told them about a father who was supposed to be dead, but never, in the darkest part of her, had felt dead. "Mine," her soul said into his. "My mate, my choice, mine. Yours," he answered. "Always. Only ever yours." The light exploded outward in one final blinding pulse, and then faded entirely. Seren collapsed forward against his chest. Beneath her ear, a heartbeat, strong, steady, warm. Seren. His hand came up slowly, stroking her hair. "Look at me." She raised her head. His eyes were clear. The frost was gone. Color had returned to his face. "You saved me," he said. "You found me first," she whispered. He pulled her close and kissed her, soft and deliberate, full of everything that had accumulated between them across 3 years of distance. Around them, Ren was already cheering. Ash said, "Finally." Marin from the doorway made a sound that might have been a laugh. In the corner, bound and broken, Cassia watched and said nothing. For the first time in her life, there was nothing left to say. They returned to Vdora 3 weeks later. Word had already spread. Messengers had ridden ahead, carrying the truth. Cassia's confession, extracted before witnesses. Marin's testimony is supported by her meticulous records, the guards' accounts of the Queen's attempt on the lives of the royal heirs. By the time the royal procession reached the capital, people were lining the streets, not to question, not to jeer, to celebrate. "The true Queen," someone called as Serene's carriage passed. The cry spread through the crowd the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast, unstoppable, impossible to contain once it had caught. "Mama," Ren tugged at her sleeve. "They're happy to see us." "They are," Seren said. Her voice caught slightly. "They really are." Cassia's trial was thorough and brief. The verdict was never in question. Theron had offered an alternative to the sentence her crimes warranted: exile, a remote island at the edge of the known world, stripped of title, stripped of name, forbidden to return on pain of execution. Seren had agreed to the mercy, not for Cassia's sake, for her children's. She didn't want their earliest memories stained with their aunt's blood. Lord Harwin had faced his own reckoning. The truth of what he had done to Serene's mother, suppressed for 22 years beneath threats and strategic silence, came out in full during the trial. He sat now in the dungeons, stripped of everything, awaiting formal sentencing. Seren had visited him once, stood at the bars and looked at the man who had spent 2 decades making her feel like a mistake. "You were wrong about me," she had said. "Wrong about my mother. Wrong about everything." He had stared back with his old familiar hatred. She had walked away without looking back. The coronation took place at midsummer. She knelt before the altar in the great cathedral, the same cathedral where Cassia had stood in her place 3 years before, and felt the weight of everything it had taken to arrive at this particular moment. Theron lifted the crown from its velvet cushion, moonstone and silver catching the light from the stained glass windows in fractures of color across the stone floor. "Seren of Vora," he said, his voice carrying through the vast space, clear and certain. "My true mate, mother of my heirs, the woman I should have married from the beginning." He placed the crown on her head. "Rise, my queen." She rose. The cathedral erupted. Her eyes found the front row. Ash, solemn in his new formal clothes, was making a visible effort to stand still and not fidget. Ren, already waving with both hands, bouncing on her toes, was thoroughly unimpressed by the concept of cathedral decorum. Marin, with tears making quiet tracks down her weathered face. Behind them, yet the witnesses who had come forward, palace servants, guards, people who had carried pieces of the truth for years and finally had somewhere safe to put them. Seren nodded to them all. Later, when the feast was well underway and the great hall rang with celebration, she slipped out onto a balcony above the gardens, footsteps behind her. She knew who it was without turning. "Escaping your own coronation." Theron settled beside her at the railing, his arm coming around her. "Just taking a moment." She leaned into him. 3 years ago, I was hanging laundry in Thornwick. It's a significant adjustment." "You'll never have to run again," he said. "I know." She turned to look at him. The man she had found in a darkened library. The man who had taught her what it felt like to be seen. The man whose children laughed from somewhere inside the hall at a volume that suggested Ren had discovered the dessert table. "I'm not sure I deserve any of this," she said. "You deserve everything." His voice was fierce with it. "Every crown, every moment of happiness. You earned all of it." He kissed her, slow and thorough and full of promise. "Mama, Papa." Ren's voice from the doorway with the urgency of someone reporting a genuine crisis. "They won't cut the cake without you." Serene laughed against his lips. Duty calls, Theron murmured. It always will. She took his hand. But we answer it together now. They walked back into the light. Behind them, the moon rose full and silver over Vora. It should have felt like an ending. It didn't. 3 months after the coronation, a fishing boat out of the southern port of Mervain pulled something unexpected from the water. Not something. Someone. A woman. Half drowned, clinging to the wreckage of what had once been a small vessel. Her hands were raw from cold and salt water. Her fine traveling clothes, the kind that suggested she had once been a person of consequence, were ruined beyond recognition. The fishermen brought her to shore. They gave her warmth, water, and shelter. They asked her name. She didn't give it. What she did give them once she had eaten, once the color had returned to her face, once the particular focus had returned to her golden eyes, was a question. "The island to the north," she said. "The Exile Island. Is there a healer there? Someone who deals in things that ordinary healers won't touch?" The oldest fisherman looked at her for a long time. "There's a woman," he said finally, "in the cliffs, but she doesn't see just anyone." "She'll see me," the woman said. She was right. The woman on the cliffs, ancient, sharp-eyed, the kind of old that suggested she had stopped counting decades somewhere around her 2nd century, opened her door without being knocked upon and looked at her visitor with an expression that was not surprise. "I wondered when you'd find me," the old woman said. "You know who I am," Cassia said. "I know what you came for." The old woman stepped back from the door. "Come in. We have much to discuss." "Then you'll help me." The old woman smiled. "I'll do better than help you," she said. "I'll teach you." "Teach me what?" "Everything your sister's mother knew." She let the silence sit for exactly 1 beat. "And everything she didn't." Cassia stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind her. In the palace of Vora, 1,000 miles away, Seren was laughing at something her children had done. She didn't feel the particular chill that passed through the island air when the door closed. She didn't hear the old woman begin to speak. She didn't know. She didn't know that 3 months of exile had not broken her sister. It had only changed the shape of what she was becoming. And the old woman teaching her had been waiting for a very long time for exactly this. The story of Seren and Theron was not over. It had only just begun. If you made it this far, thank you, truly. Seren's story is one I've been wanting to tell for a while now. The quiet ones who survive in the margins, who build entire lives out of necessity, or and who turn out to have been extraordinary all along. If you want to know what Cassia is being taught, if you want to know what the old woman on the cliffs actually is and why she's been waiting, part 2 is coming. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it when it does. And tell me in the comments, did you see the cliffhanger coming? What do you think the old woman is teaching her? I will read every single one. Until next time.